The first bell doesn't simply ring, it cuts through the dark. Not the kind of bell you hear on a bright feast day in some tourist square, warm, cheerful, surrounded by footsteps and laughter. This one sounds at the hour when the rest of the world is still wrapped in heavy blankets, when even the trees seem to be holding their breath. I wake up on a mattress stuffed with straw, the air so cold it feels sharp against my skin. For a heartbeat, I don't move. I just listen, because in a place like this, sound is never just sound. A bell isn't an announcement, it's a command. It's time itself, reaching into the room and pulling us out by the collar. Around me, bodies stir in the darkness. One after another, women sit up, dozens of them, moving like a single creature learning to breathe. No one calls anyone's name. Names here are treated like jewelry, something you keep hidden, something you're expected to let go of. My hands find the habit, coarse wool, thick and heavy, almost like armor. I pull it around my shoulders, and the fabric drags with real weight, settling onto me the way a decision settles onto your life. I draw my veil into place. The air smells of old timber, cold stone, and candle soot. Somewhere far off, I catch a trace of beeswax, sweet, faint, swallowed by the chill. We stand and we form a line without being told. Then we walk. Down a narrow corridor, our footsteps soft on stone. Cloth brushes cloth. A muffled cough here, a quiet inhale there. Everything else is swallowed by the rule of silence. We move as if the building itself is guiding us. The passage is dim, the walls damp, the torch niches like little scars of light. When a draft slips through, it makes the flames shiver and the shadows slide along the arches. And then the chapel door opens. The darkness inside is deeper than the corridor, but it's a different kind of dark, older, higher, full of space. The ceiling rises into a vaulted roof that disappears into shadow. A few candles burn, thin points of light floating in the gloom. Their smoke climbs slowly, as if the air here has learned not to hurry. We take our places in the choir stalls. And the chant begins. It isn't singing the way the world sings. It's chanting, Latin words shaped into a single tide of sound. The notes rise, strike the stone, and come back to us as echoes. It feels as though the chapel isn't just a room, but an instrument, built to hold prayer the way a cup holds water. I don't understand every word, not yet, but I know the rhythm. I know how my breath is supposed to fall into the same pattern as everyone else's. There's a strange comfort in that even when you're exhausted, especially when you're exhausted. Because that's the secret of this place. It doesn't run on inspiration, it runs on repetition. Out there beyond these walls, people measure their days by work, by meals, by markets opening and closing. Here, we measure the day by bells and psalms. It's as if time has been folded into a new shape, a loop, a wheel. And while we chant, I feel that familiar, unsettling thing again, that sense that we're not alone. Not in a childish way, not as if ghosts are standing in the aisles. It's something subtler than that, like the stone remembers, like the walls have absorbed so many voices over so many years that the air itself still knows the shape of their prayers. When I open my mouth, the sound feels like it's joining something already in motion. There are nights when that thought steadies me. There are nights when it frightens me. Because a cloister doesn't let you hide, not from noise, not from people, not even from yourself. The world outside is full of distractions, busy streets, family voices, gossip, small pleasures you don't even notice you rely on. Here, those things are gone, and what's left is your own mind, your own doubts, your own hunger for meaning. The bell calls again in my memory, and I can almost hear it inside my ribs. This is why some people call places like this a fortress, not because it's filled with soldiers, but because it's built to hold a line against everything that tries to pull you back into ordinary life. And yet, it's not ordinary life I'm missing tonight. It's the version of myself I left behind. My name is Isabeau. I'm 17 years old. And by the time the bell rings in the pre-dawn dark, I've already learned something the world rarely admits. Not everyone gets to choose what kind of life they'll live. Some of us are carried into our futures by decisions made in rooms we were never invited into. I became part of this convent months ago, but the feeling is still new enough to sting. Sometimes I catch myself thinking the word enclosed and feeling it in my throat. Enclosure isn't just a wall, it's a rule, it's a promise. It's a boundary drawn not only around a building, but around a person. Once, before I came here, I used to be afraid of darkness. Now I'm afraid of something else, the moments when I hear my own thoughts too clearly.
The chant moves through another psalm. My voice joins the others. The sound is calm, controlled, nothing wild, nothing dramatic. Yet there's power in it, a kind of power the world outside doesn't always recognize. Because when you gather a group of people and teach them to move together, to breathe together, to return to the same words again and again, you create something stronger than a mood. You create a rhythm, a structure, a machine made of human will. From a modern point of view, you might call it a system, a schedule that keeps attention from wandering too far, a routine that resets the mind every few hours. You might even call it psychological training, and you wouldn't be entirely wrong. But here, we call it devotion. And devotion has a cost. The cost is sleep, the cost is comfort, the cost is freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedom to drift wherever you want, whenever you want. The cost is the quiet understanding that this place will ask you for everything, not once, but daily, again and again, until you stop thinking of it as loss and start thinking of it as your shape. The candlelight trembles as if it's listening. Somewhere far off, outside these walls, the village still sleeps. Fires are banged low, animals settle in their stalls. The world dreams in the dark, unaware that our day has already begun. And I wonder, not for the first time, who Deville is really for. Is it for God? Is it for the sisters? Or is it for us, so we never forget that time is always moving, even when the world looks still? The psalm ends, we shift, quiet as shadows, another begins. My breath steadies, my voice stops shaking. For a few minutes I almost feel as though I belong here without question. Then a thought slips in, small, dangerous, honest. How many women before me stood in the same place, listening to the same bell, wondering the same thing? And how many of them stayed because they truly chose this life? And how many stayed because the door behind them had already closed? The bell does not answer. It never does. It simply returns again and again, marking the hours like a blade carving lines into stone, until the lines become a pattern, and the pattern becomes your life. And tonight, in the pre-dawn dark, I chant with the others and feel the chapel breathe around us, as if the building itself is alive, cold, ancient, and patient. Because the world outside might forget us. History might not record our names. But the bell remembers. And every time it rings, it calls us back into the same truth. Here, time belongs to God. And so, for now, so do we.
I wasn't born into a castle, but I was born close enough to one that people expected my life to follow a familiar script. My family are minor nobles, land, a name, a hall with a smoky hearth and a few tired tapestries on the walls. We had dignity, yes, we had tradition, but we didn't have endless silver, and in our world, silver matters more than people admit. For a son, you can spend your money on a horse, a sword, a well-made coat of mail, and the right friendships. For a daughter, you spend it on something quieter and more terrifying, a dowry, the price of being accepted into another household, the price of becoming someone's wife. I had 2 sisters. The eldest was already married. The second was being negotiated over like a parcel of land, her future traded in careful conversations between men who smiled too often. And then there was me, the third daughter, the leftover piece of a problem nobody wanted to speak out loud. My mother never said, "You are too much." She didn't need to. She would just look at me for a heartbeat too long, as if she were memorizing my face before handing me over to whatever came next. My father was more practical. He talked about safety. He talked about honor. He talked about how a convent was a good place for a girl like me. He even said the words that made it sound almost generous. You'll learn to read properly. And yes, that was true. A convent was one of the few roads open to women that didn't end at marriage. But here's the part people often miss. Calling it a choice can be misleading. Sometimes it is a calling. Sometimes it's an escape. Sometimes it's simply what happens when the math of inheritance and dowries doesn't work out. Still, I can't pretend the idea of the convent didn't pull at me before my father decided. I remember the first time I met a nun up close. She had come to our manor to speak with my mother. She wasn't young and she wasn't sweet. She didn't charm anyone, but she carried a kind of calm that made the room adjust itself around her. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to threaten. When she spoke, the air simply seemed to quiet down and listen. I hid near a doorway, half behind a hanging cloth, and I listened. She spoke about the night prayers, about the bell that summons you when the rest of the world is asleep, about the discipline as silence, and the strange freedom of not having to perform yourself for anyone. She talked about work too, gardens, linens, the sickbed, the slow craft of copying words on parchment. Nothing in her voice sounded like romance, and that's exactly why it stayed with me. Then she said something I never forgot. Out there, she said, a woman's life is defined by the man who will call her wife. In here, a woman's life is defined by what she dares to call a vow. I didn't know what to do with that sentence at the time.
It sounded like poetry, and poetry can be dangerous because it makes hard things feel beautiful. But underneath it was a truth that felt sharp. Inside the convent, a woman could become something other than a bargaining chip. So when my father began speaking about the convent as if it were my future, I didn't scream, I didn't beg, I didn't run. I listened. And when the moment came, when the decision became official, I surprised myself by feeling something close to relief, as if the road had been chosen and I could stop pretending there were endless possibilities. The day I left the manor, the sky was the color of ash. A small escort rode with me. Nothing grand, just enough to look respectable and keep trouble away. My father's cloak snapped in the wind when he turned to give me his final instructions. My mother didn't cry. She placed a hand on my sleeve, held it for a moment, and then let go as if she were releasing a bird she wasn't sure could fly. The road to the convent felt longer than it should have. Fields stretched out, pale and empty. Cold mist rose from the ground. Somewhere, a church bell in a distant village answered another, and for a moment it felt like the world itself was speaking in signals I couldn't interpret. When the convent finally appeared on the horizon, it didn't look like sanctuary. It looked like stone and rules made visible. High walls, a gatehouse, a bell tower that seemed to watch the landscape like an eye that never closes. At the gate, a portress appeared behind an iron-grilled window. She asked questions. She looked at the letter my father carried. And then, with a kind of practiced calm, she opened the door. Inside, the air was quieter, different. The noise of travel died instantly, as if the walls absorbed it. My parents didn't follow me far. They were led to a parlor where a metal grill separated visitors from the cloister. It was the first time I felt separation as something physical. My mother stood on the other side, close enough that I could see the lines at the corners of her eyes. But the iron bars were between us, and I could not cross them. I wanted to reach out, I wanted to touch her hand, but the gesture died halfway, not because anyone shouted no, but because the rule was already in the air, like cold. I lowered my hand, my mother lowered hers. We both pretended it didn't hurt. Then I turned because there's a moment in every leaving where you either hesitate until someone pushes you, or you walk forward on your own. I walked. A senior nun, my novice mistress, led me through corridors and arches into the inner world of the convent. She showed me a straw mattress, a blanket, a peg for my clothing. The room smelled of wool and old wood, and the faint tang of smoke that never fully leaves stone walls. "This is yours," she said, and it sounded simple, but it wasn't, because in that sentence was the beginning of a new truth. Nothing here would belong to me the way things belong to me at home. Even mine meant assigned. I didn't become a full nun that day. That's another thing people often misunderstand. You don't simply arrive and take vows like putting on a new dress. You become a novice first. You live in the rhythm. You learn the prayers. You learn the work. You learn the rules, especially the ones that don't exist on paper, but exist in the bones of the community. That period is not only the convent testing you, it's you testing the convent. You find out what your soul does when sleep is interrupted night after night. You find out what your mind does when it has no place to run. You find out whether your obedience is real or merely politeness. I learned the hours of prayer, the way the day breaks apart into sacred fragments, night prayer, morning prayer, the smaller offices that return again and again like a tide coming in. The bell told you when to stand, when to kneel, when to work, when to return. It didn't ask how you felt. It didn't care whether you were inspired. It simply required you to be present. From a modern point of view, I can name what it does to you. It rewires your attention. It trains your mind to step out of itself and return to a shared rhythm. It's exhausting, yes, but it also does something strange. It makes your private anxieties feel less powerful, because you're constantly being pulled back into something larger than your own thoughts. And yet, that same structure can feel like a cage. That's the paradox of it. The same routine that steadies you can also suffocate you. I learned silence, not just the absence of speech, but the discipline of it, the way you swallow words before they become habits. I learned how to move through corridors without unnecessary noise, how to look without staring, how to exist without drawing attention to myself. I learned that in a community like this, your smallest habits matter, because the smallest habits become the cracks where disorder begins. When the novice period ended, I was brought before the abbess. She asked me if I understood what I was doing, if I understood what it meant to promise poverty, chastity, obedience, not as ideas but as a life. And she asked me in a voice that made the room feel smaller, whether I wanted this, truly. I expected my voice to shake, but it didn't. I said yes. And then came the ceremony. Simple, solemn. A few candles, the weight of eyes, the sound of chant. My hair was cut. Not violently, not dramatically, just a clean snip that sent a lock falling like a small piece of the old world landing on stone. I received the habit. The wool was heavy in my hands, heavier than I imagined, as if it were trying to teach me immediately that devotion is not light. When the abbess placed it upon me, it felt like putting on a life that had already been waiting. Afterward, we walked to the inner gate. The abbess stood beside me with her keys. The iron ring looked ordinary, and yet I knew what it meant. Control, protection, boundary. She didn't smile. She didn't try to comfort me with soft words. She simply said, almost gently, that this door doesn't only keep the world out, it keeps you in, especially on the days you want to leave. Then she turned the key. The lock clicked. The gate swung shut. And the sound, iron meeting iron, settled in my chest like a new heartbeat. That night, lying on straw, listening to wind in the roof beams, I understood something clearly for the first time. Leaving the world isn't the same as forgetting it. You carry it with you. Every face, every fear, every unfinished thought. The convent doesn't erase them. It takes away the noise that used to hide them. And in that silence, you meet yourself. Not as you pretend to be, as you are. And in the dark, with the bell waiting somewhere beyond sleep, I wondered what kind of person I would become, now that the door behind me had closed.
People imagine the cloister as a place where the world simply stops, as if you step through a door and everything outside fades like a bad dream. That isn't how it feels. What really happens is this. The world doesn't disappear. It gets pressed flat. It becomes quieter, farther away, harder to touch, yet somehow sharper in your memory. And the thing that changes most is not the world, it's you. My convent follows the Benedictine way. The rule of Saint Benedict is known for balance, prayer and work, discipline and stability. People describe it as moderate, as if that means gentle. But moderate here doesn't mean easy. It means total. It means your whole day is claimed, not by extremes, but by a steady, unrelenting rhythm. The buildings reflect that rhythm. From the outside, the convent looks like a fortress. Pale stone walls, a gatehouse, a bell tower, narrow windows. If you stand in the fields beyond, you can see the cross banner lifting and falling in the wind. You can see the roofline of the chapel. You can see the place, but you cannot really see the life inside it. Inside, the convent is a small world built around a center. The chapel is its heart. Everything else circles it. The cloister walkways that wrap around a square garden, the chapter house where we meet and correct ourselves, the refectory where we eat in silence, the kitchen, the storerooms, the infirmary, and the dormitory where we sleep in rows on straw. All of it is designed to do one thing: keep your mind from wandering too far away from God. Even the architecture feels like instruction. The cloister arcades repeat their arches again and again, teaching your eyes to accept repetition. The stone floors are cold, teaching you to endure. The narrow windows ration light, so you never forget the difference between comfort and necessity. And then there is the wall. People talk about enclosure as if it's only a physical barrier. A high wall, a locked door, iron bars, a gatehouse. Yes, all of that is real. But enclosure is also an idea, and it lives everywhere in the convent. It lives in the way we speak, carefully, and often not at all. It lives in the way visitors are kept at a distance, through a grill, through a hatch, through a turntable that passes objects without allowing bodies to meet. It lives in the way you learn not to reach out, even when you want to. The first time I stood near the inner gate, I realized how heavy a door can feel when it carries meaning. The wood was thick, banded with iron. The lock looked ordinary, like any lock you'd find on a chest, until you understood what it protected. The abbess stood beside me with a ring of keys, each one a small piece of authority. She didn't speak at length. She didn't need to. She only said that the gate doesn't just keep the world out, it keeps you in, especially on the day you think you've made a mistake. And then she shut it. There was a click, a final metallic sound that didn't echo much, but it landed inside me anyway, like a dot placed at the end of a sentence. After that, I began noticing boundaries everywhere. The choir screen in the chapel, separating us from the sanctuary where the priest stands. The parlor grill, separating us from family. The rule itself, separating impulse from action. Even time is a kind of wall here. Because time is not free, it belongs to the bell. In the world outside, time can be spent, wasted, sold, traded. Out there, people say things like, "I'll do it later." Here, later is not yours to own. Here, later belongs to the next office, the next duty, the next moment when the bell interrupts what you want and demands what the rule requires. And yet, the strangest boundary is the vow of poverty. From the outside, people imagine a nun as someone with nothing, no property, no money, no possessions. That's true, personally. A nun is not supposed to own anything privately. The clothes on my body belong to the community. The book I read belongs to the house. Even the needle I use can be taken and given to someone else if the abbess decides. But the convent as an institution can own quite a lot. Land, buildings, livestock, rents, gifts, charters sealed with wax. In some places, convents are wealthy enough to feed the poor at the gate and still store grain for winter. So poverty becomes complicated. We live simply, but the house must survive. The house must be managed. Someone must count sacks in the storeroom, check barrels, tally what comes in and what goes out. Someone must negotiate with patrons. Someone must answer to bishops and local powers. The abbess does not only lead our prayers, she governs an estate. And once I saw that clearly, I realized something that feels very modern. The convent is not only a spiritual refuge, it's also an organization, a structured community, a system that has to balance ideals against reality. Some days that balance holds beautifully. Other days you can feel the strain.
When winter bites hard, when firewood runs low, when the storeroom jars look emptier than they should, the vow of poverty stops being an abstract virtue and becomes a practical problem. And on the other side of the coin, when gifts arrive, fine cloth, extra food, a generous donation, you can sense another danger, comfort creeping in quietly like a small animal finding a warm place to sleep. The abbess watches those dangers as carefully as she watches our discipline. Because a convent doesn't fall apart in a single dramatic moment. It erodes, slowly, through small exceptions that turn into habits. This is why enclosure and routine matter so much. They are not only pious practices, they are the beams holding up the roof. Sometimes when I think about it with a modern mind, I understand the psychology of it. A community like this can't rely on every person feeling holy every day. It has to rely on structure. It has to rely on habits that keep you moving even when your heart is tired. In a strange way, the rule is both a burden and a mercy. It carries you when you cannot carry yourself. But it also demands a price. Privacy, for one. In the dormitory, there are no private rooms, just rows of mattresses. The air holds everyone's breathing, everyone's coughs, everyone's restlessness. Even in sleep, you are part of the group. There is comfort in that, and there is also exposure. And there is the greater sacrifice, the loss of easy escape. When I lived at home, I could always walk away from discomfort. If a room grew tense, I could find another room. If a day felt unbearable, I could distract myself. Music, chatter, movement, errands. In the convent, distraction is limited by design. You can work, you can pray, you can rest, you can speak only when permitted. And in the quiet spaces between those things, your thoughts rise like smoke. The first nights after the gate closed behind me, I lay awake staring at the rafters and listening to the building. The convent has its own voice. The hush of wind against stone, the distant clink of keys, the soft scrape of sandals on the floor, the faint creak of wood settling in the cold. The building is never loud, but it is never silent either. It's like living inside a great sleeping creature, ancient and patient. There's a moment that comes late at night when you realize the walls are not just around you. They are inside you now. You begin to anticipate the next bell. You begin to measure your own thoughts by whether they fit inside the rule. You begin to judge yourself without anyone needing to speak. That's when you understand what enclosure really does. It doesn't only prevent you from leaving physically, it prevents you from leaving mentally, unless you choose to break the vow. And for many of us, breaking the vow isn't just breaking a rule, it's breaking the only life we have left. So yes, the wall is high, the gate is locked, the grill is iron. But the stronger barrier is the one built from repetition, from shared discipline, from the weight of years pressing down on your shoulders like the wool of the habit. And still, in spite of the cold, in spite of the exhaustion, in spite of the sharp edge of longing that sometimes rises without warning, there is something else here too. Purpose. When the bell calls, you rise. When the chant begins, you join. When the day demands work, you work. Nothing is accidental. Nothing is vague. The life is narrow, but it is clear. That clarity can feel like shelter. And sometimes in the darkest hours, when the candles burn low and the chapel smells of stone and stone, and our voices lift into the vault like breath rising from a winter field, I feel it. Not certainty exactly, but a kind of steadiness, as if the walls are not only keeping something out, but also keeping something in. Keeping in the rhythm, keeping in the vow, keeping in the part of me that might otherwise dissolve into the noise of the world.
The bell rules everything here. If you want to understand what life inside a medieval convent feels like, don't start with the walls, start with the sound. Because long before anyone sees you, before anyone speaks to you, before your feet even touch the cold chapel stones, time has already decided where you belong next. In the world outside, people wake when their bodies are ready, or when their work demands it. Here, we wake because the bell says so, and it doesn't care whether you slept deeply or barely at all. It begins in the darkest part of the night. One moment, I'm drifting, half warm under a wool blanket, and the next moment, the bell is pulling me upright, sharp, insistent, impossible to ignore. In the dormitory, no one groans aloud, no one complains. We rise like a single body learning to move in silence. Habits come on, heavy wool, veil, belt, each piece settling with its own weight, as if it's reminding you that devotion is not light. We file down the corridor and into the chapel for the night office, what many call matins or vigils. The chapel is cold, dim, and vast in a way that makes you feel small, but also strangely protected. Candlelight barely touches the stone vaults above. Our breath shows as pale mist when we chant. The chanting begins softly and then gathers strength, not because we get louder, but because the sound finds the shape of the building. It climbs into the arches and returns as an echo, as if the chapel is answering us in its own language. There are nights when I barely understand the Latin. My mind lags behind the words, but the rhythm carries me anyway. I've learned something important. The convent doesn't run on personal inspiration. It runs on repetition.
Even when your thoughts are scattered, your body remembers the pattern. Stand, bow, chant, listen, breathe, begin again. When matins ends, the darkness outside is thinner. Somewhere the horizon begins to soften. We move into louds, the office that welcomes the morning. It feels like the world is being rebuilt, quietly, right in front of us. A faint line of light slips through narrow windows. Smoke from the candles turns that light into visible beams. Dust motes drift like tiny stars caught in daylight. After louds, you might think the day finally begins. In a way, it does, but the bell will not let it become your day. Because prayer does not happen once in the morning and once at night. It returns again and again, threading itself through every task until nothing is separate from it. The next office comes around the time the sky has fully turned from black to gray. We call it prime. It's shorter than matins, but it has the same effect. It resets you. It pulls you out of yourself and drops you back into the shared rhythm of the house. Then the work begins. Some sisters go to the kitchen, some to the garden, some to the infirmary, some to the workrooms where linen is folded, wool is spun, cloth is mended. Those who can read may go to the scriptorium to copy texts, to prepare ink, to shape letters with a steady hand. I've learned to keep my hands busy. Wool work is good for that. Spinning forces your body into patience. The spindle turns because you let gravity do its work, and because your fingers keep a steady draft. If you rush, the thread breaks. If you daydream too much, it tangles. It teaches you to stay present. But no matter what you're doing, spinning, scrubbing, carrying baskets, writing, there's a rule you never forget. When the bell calls, you stop. Mid-morning, the bell rings again for terse. It's almost shocking how quickly everyone moves. A moment ago, you were in the middle of a stitch or a sentence. Now your hands set the work down neatly, as if the task never mattered as much as the next prayer. We walk back through the cloister arcade, footsteps echoing under the arches. Robes swing with real weight. Cold air follows you like a reminder that comfort is not the point. Terse is brief. A few psalms, a hymn, a prayer, a bow. And then we return to work. Every time this happens, it does something to your mind. It trains you to release whatever you're holding. Your irritation, your concentration, your pride in a task well done, because the bell has priority. From a modern perspective, you could say it keeps the nervous system from locking into one state for too long. It interrupts, it resets, it forces a kind of mental humility. But in the convent, we don't talk about nervous systems. We talk about obedience. And then comes the high point of the morning, Mass. We cannot celebrate it ourselves. That belongs to the priest. So a chaplain comes, usually attached to the convent or visiting from a nearby monastery. He stands on the sanctuary side, beyond the choir screen. We remain on our side, behind the lattice, hearing his Latin prayers carried through wood and stone. There's a quiet strangeness to that separation. We are present but not close. We are part of the liturgy but also kept at a distance. Sometimes I feel that distance like a sting. Other times it feels like protection, another boundary meant to keep our focus sharp. When the moment of communion arrives, it happens through a small opening. Everything is careful, everything is controlled. No excess movement, no confusion. Even the most sacred act in the day is carried out with the same disciplined physicality as any other task here. After Mass, the day continues, but it does not loosen. Around the middle of the day, the bell rings again for sext. The sun is highest, even in winter. Light fills the cloister and turns the stone pale. Sext is another short office, but it lands like a marker in your bones. Half the day is gone, whether you feel ready or not. Then we eat. The meal is plain. Bread, pottage, maybe vegetables, sometimes eggs or fish, depending on the season in the house. We eat in silence while one sister reads aloud from a holy text. It's a strange kind of double feeding. Food for the body, words for the mind. After the meal, work resumes. Hands return to wool, to ink, to herbs, to cleaning the chapel, to carrying supplies. And again, the bell returns. Mid-afternoon, none is sung. Another stop, another reset, another reminder that nothing you do here is purely practical. Even the most ordinary labor is meant to sit under the shadow of prayer. By late afternoon, tiredness becomes a constant companion. Not the dramatic kind of exhaustion you can complain about, but a quiet weariness that settles into your limbs. You learn to move through it because no one is waiting to rescue you from it. The structure assumes you will continue. Then evening comes. Vespers is the most beautiful office to me. There's something about chanting while the light fades that feels like surrender in the best sense. The candles are brighter now, the chapel warmer with bodies, the air layered with smoke and the faint spice of incense. We sing psalms of praise and thanksgiving. And for a moment, the day feels gathered into something whole. After Vespers, there is still work. Small tasks, preparation for the next day, quiet chores that keep the house running. And then Complain arrives, the final office. Complain closes the day like a door. The chant is gentler, protective. The prayers ask for safety through the night, for forgiveness, for peace. When it ends, the convent shifts into the great silence. No talking, no unnecessary movement. The building itself seems to hold its breath. We walk back to the dormitory under dim lantern light. Sandals whisper on stone. The air is cold again. In the dormitory, bodies settle onto straw mattresses, still clothed, ready to rise again when the bell demands it. And just when sleep finally begins to pull me under, just when my mind starts to loosen its grip, somewhere in the depth of night, the bell returns. Matins again. The loop begins again. This is what people don't understand when they imagine monastic life is slow or empty. It isn't empty. It's crowded, crowded with structure, crowded with repetition, crowded with the constant act of beginning again. There are days when I feel lifted by it, like the rhythm is carrying me, and there are days when I feel worn thin, as if I'm being sanded down by the same motions, the same chants, the same cold stone. But whether I feel strong or weak, one truth remains. The bell does not negotiate. It simply calls, and we answer again and again, until the rhythm becomes not just the schedule of the convent, but the shape of our lives.
Or comfort you. It's meant to remind you, every time you move, that you chose simplicity, whether you feel noble or miserable that day. I learned to spin on a drop spindle, watching twist travel up the thread, learning the exact pressure of fingers. Too much hurry and the thread snaps. Too little attention and it tangles into a knot you'll fight for the next hour. There's a strange honesty to it. Wool does not care about your feelings. It only answers to patience. Some sisters are astonishing with a needle. In certain convents, embroidery becomes a true art. Altar cloths, vestments, decorative borders, small stitches forming saints, vines, and sacred symbols. Outside, these things might be treated as luxury. Here, they are treated as offering. Each stitch becomes a kind of silent prayer, repeated until the pattern is complete. And then, one afternoon, I was called away from the spindles. The novice mistress led me down a corridor, into a quieter room with a different smell. Ink, parchment, and dust warmed by a thin stripe of sunlight. The scriptorium. Not every convent has a full writing room like the great monasteries of men, but even a modest house will often have books and some place to care for them. A small library, a desk or two, a shelf of volumes wrapped in cloth, enough to keep the words alive. I had been taught letters at home, just enough to read simple prayers and family accounts. Here, literacy is not a polite accomplishment. It's a tool. It's responsibility. The first thing I learned was that books are heavy in a way modern people don't expect. A choir book is not a slim object you carry under your arm. It's a large, stubborn thing. Thick parchment pages, wooden covers, leather straps. It takes 2 hands to lift, and when you turn a page, you have to do it carefully because the parchment resists like stiff cloth. Parchment itself feels alive. It holds the memory of skin. It curls if the air is damp. It can split if you force it. Sometimes I helped prepare it, smoothing, scraping, checking for flaws, before the writing even began. Then there is ink. Ink has its own temperament. Too thin and it bleeds. Too thick and it clots in a quill. Sometimes my job was to grind pigment and mix it with binder until it flowed properly. It sounds simple, but nothing here is allowed to be careless. A single blot can ruin a page that took days to prepare. I started with basic tasks, setting out tools, trimming quills, keeping the desk clean. And then, slowly, I was trusted with more. Copying. Copying is not like writing a letter. It's slower, stricter. You don't express yourself, you serve the text. Your hand becomes a bridge between one generation and the next. The aim is not originality. The aim is survival, keeping a psalm, a prayer, a teaching from disappearing. From a modern point of view, I can see what this really is. It's cultural infrastructure, unseen work that holds a civilization together. If someone doesn't copy the words vanish. If the words vanish, the memory vanishes. And once memory goes, everything becomes smaller, poorer, easier to break. But the thing that truly seized my imagination wasn't the ink. It was the color. One day, the senior sister opened a small box as if she were opening a reliquary. Inside were tiny wrapped bundles, pigments, reds and ochres, greens, a bit of gold leaf used sparingly. And then she showed me the one that made my breath catch, a deep blue so intense it looked almost unreal. Ultramarine. It comes from lapis lazuli, a stone brought from far away, beyond seas and mountains, carried along trade routes that feel like legends to someone who lives behind walls. When you hold that pigment, you're holding distance. You're holding the labor of miners, merchants, mule trains, and ships. You're holding something so rare it is saved for the holiest images, the robe of the Virgin, the vault of heaven, the letter that begins a sacred chant. We used it carefully. No waste, no second chances. When you paint, you have to shape the brush tip, keep it fine. There's an old habit, common among scribes, of bringing the brush briefly to the lips to make the point sharper. I had heard a story that some illuminators even ended up with traces of pigment in their teeth over time. At first I thought it sounded like a rumor. Then I found myself doing it without thinking and understood how easily small habits become evidence. That blue felt like a secret passing through my hands. I remember sitting by a narrow window with the cold light on my fingers. I was outlining an initial letter, one of those large decorative capitals that begins a psalm. My wrist ached from holding steady. My breath slowed because even breathing too hard could shake the line. The pigment went on smooth and dark, and then when it dried, it settled into something that looked almost like night sky. In that moment, I understood why people say the convent is cut off from the world, and why that phrase isn't quite right. We are cut off from noise, yes, from crowds, from markets, from travel, but we are not cut off from meaning. If anything, we are surrounded by it. A sister's work might never be seen by the village. A page might sit on a shelf for decades,
and yet the work matters because it is part of something larger than any one life. Sometimes we hear of women who did this work before us, women whose names are rare, but not entirely lost. A German nun named Guda, for example, is remembered because she left a small self-image in a manuscript. It's almost shocking, a woman in a world that rarely preserved women's voices, quietly placing herself into history with paint and ink. I think about that often, because in the convent, you can disappear, and you can also endure. The world might never know your face, but your work might outlive you. Not all sisters work with books, of course. The convent needs many kinds of hands. Some cook, some tend gardens, some care for the sick, some keep the chapel clean, making sure candles are ready, linens are washed, the altar is prepared. Everyone has a role, even if it's small, because small roles are the ones that keep a community alive. But for me, the scriptorium became a second chapel, a place where silence isn't empty, it's focused. When I write, I can't drift, I can't rush, I can't perform. The page forces honesty. And the strangest part is that in a life built on rules, writing gives you a kind of interior freedom. Not the freedom to do what you want, but the freedom to concentrate so deeply that the world falls away. Then the bell rings, and everything stops. That's the rule. No matter how close you are to finishing a line, no matter how perfect the curve of a letter, no matter how rare the pigment on your brush, when the bell calls, you set it down, you stand, you go to prayer. It's frustrating at first. It feels like interruption. But over time you realize the interruption is the point. It teaches you not to cling, not even to good work, not even to beauty. The bell reminds you who owns the day. And so my days became this strange braid, chant and thread, parchment and prayer, blue pigment and cold stone. A life that looks small from far away, but up close feels like it's made of countless deliberate acts. Quiet acts, hidden acts, the kind of acts history rarely applauds. But in the candlelit hush of a medieval convent, they are the way we keep the world from going dark.
If it spreads. There are hours when we may speak for work, for instruction, for necessity, but unnecessary chatter is discouraged, and after night prayer, compline, the great silence begins. That means no talking at all until morning, not a whisper, not a question, not even a comforting word, unless someone is truly ill and needs care. At first, I found it almost unbearable. Not because I'm talkative, I'm not, but because I discovered how often I used words to escape myself. A small comment, a laugh, a complaint, a story, tiny doors you can open to avoid sitting with your own thoughts. In the cloister, those doors are locked. So we learn to communicate differently. At meals, for example, we use simple hand signals, a gesture for bread, a gesture for water, a sign that you need something passed down the table. It looks strange if you've never seen it, like a language made of fragments, but it works, and it forces you to think before you speak, because you can't fill the air with empty words. Meals themselves are another lesson. The refectory is long and plain, wooden tables, benches, stone walls, and a lectern where one sister reads while the rest of us eat. We sit together, but we do not converse. Only the voice of the reader is allowed to rise above the soft clink of bowls and spoons. The food is simple, and it changes with the season. Most days it's bread and pottage, thick stew of grains and vegetables, sometimes beans or peas, sometimes eggs, sometimes fish when it can be had. We drink water when it's safe, but often we drink weak ale because fermented drink can be cleaner than the local water supply. It isn't indulgence, it's practical survival. The simplicity isn't meant to punish us, it's meant to train us. When you eat plain food in silence, you can't pretend you're doing anything glamorous. You can't perform. You can't impress anyone. You are just a body being fed and a soul being reminded to be grateful. Before and after meals, we pray together. And while we eat, we listen. The reading might be scripture, or the life of a saint, or a moral teaching. It creates a strange layering. Your hands are doing something ordinary, while your mind is being aimed towards something higher. Over time, I began to understand why the convent insists on this. It's not because the sisters are afraid of joy. It's because human beings are incredibly skilled at turning any moment into gossip, rivalry, or distraction. Silence isn't only holy, it's preventative. It protects the community from the slow poison of unnecessary talk. And then there's the physical side of restraint. Comfort is not the goal here. The dormitory is communal. We sleep on straw mattresses or pallets. The blankets are wool, heavy and scratchy. And in winter, the cold finds every crack in the stone. Privacy is almost non-existent. You learn to exist among others without the modern expectation of personal space. Even the habit itself is part of the discipline. It's durable, plain, and often uncomfortable. In our house, as Benedictines, the habit is black wool, simple and practical. You can feel its weight when you walk, and sometimes that weight becomes a constant reminder.
You are not here to be admired. You are here to be shaped. Of course, discipline needs enforcement. The abbess oversees the rule, but she isn't a tyrant. Most of the time, correction is quiet and ordinary. Small penances for small faults. Being late to prayer, speaking out of turn, failing in a task. Penance might mean extra prayers, or a humbling duty, or taking a meal in a less comfortable way. It's not about cruelty. It's about training. It's about keeping the community aligned. From a modern perspective, I can see how carefully designed this social system is. It's a closed community that needs internal stability. The rule creates predictable expectations. The chapter meeting creates a place where small wrongs can be admitted before they rot into bigger conflicts. The penances create accountability without breaking people. And yet, even here, human nature finds a way. There are records of sisters keeping little pets when they weren't supposed to. Dogs, rabbits, small comforts that become attachments. There are stories of gossip, of cliques forming, of simmering rivalries during elections for office. Not all convents are the same, and not all communities are equally disciplined. Even in a place devoted to holiness, people remain people. That realization was strangely comforting to me, because I entered the convent thinking I needed to become something flawless in order to belong. Then I watched older sisters, women who had lived this life for decades, lose patience, get tired, feel lonely, misunderstand one another, reconcile, start again. And I realized the point isn't to become perfect overnight. The point is to keep returning. Still, the routine can feel relentless. There are days when the silence feels like a blanket that smothers instead of warms. Days when the rules feel too tight. Days when you wonder if you've made a mistake that cannot be undone. And that's when the convent shows you another side of itself. Joy exists here, but is rare, controlled, and therefore powerful. On feast days, the rules soften slightly. The liturgy becomes more celebratory. The chapel might be decorated with flowers if the season allows. The meal might include something extra. The singing becomes fuller. There's a change in the air, as if the entire building is permitted to breathe a little more deeply. I remember one feast day when the abbess allowed us a small, almost startling indulgence. We wore simple crowns made of flowers. Nothing extravagant, just a ring of green and petals, placed carefully, as if beauty itself could be offered like incense. Some would call that frivolous, but inside the convent it felt like proof that we hadn't turned into stone. There are stories of famous abbesses who defended that kind of joy. Hildegard of Bingen, for example, is remembered not only for her visions and writings, but for insisting that beauty and music could be expressions of devotion, not distractions from it. Not everyone agreed with her, of course. Some criticized such celebrations as too loose, too worldly. But that argument between strictness and warmth never really ends. It's part of the larger struggle of religious life, how to be disciplined without becoming dead inside. Even on the happiest day, though, the structure remains. We still pray, we still keep order, and when complaint ends, the great silence still falls. The laughter, if there was any, does not carry over into the night. The flowers are set aside, the candles burn down, the routine closes around us again. And that closing is not only restriction, it's also safety. In a world outside these walls, full of uncertainty, sickness, hunger, power struggles, and constant risk, the convent offers something rare: predictability. The bell will ring, the prayers will happen, the work will be done, the community will be there. From where I stand now, I can admit this. The convent can feel like confinement. It can feel like being held. But it can also feel like being held up, held together, held away from chaos, held to a promise you might not have the strength to keep alone. So when I walk through the corridor at night, when the lantern light is low and the stone is cold beneath my feet, and the great silence presses in on all sides, I remind myself of something I've learned the hard way. This life isn't built on dramatic heroism. It's built on the faithful repetition of ordinary moments. Eating quietly, working carefully, praying again, forgiving again, beginning again. And whether that sounds like peace or prison depends on the day. But either way, the bell will ring, and I will rise.
At the head sits the abbess. She isn't only the most holy sister, as people outside like to imagine. She is the superior, yes, but she is also the governor of the house. She oversees discipline. She manages property and income. She answers to bishops. She meets messengers. She negotiates with stewards. In a world where most women's authority is confined to the household, an abbess can hold authority over land, money, and people, with the church's backing. When she looks around the room, you feel it. Not as intimidation exactly, more like gravity. Her gaze has weight. She doesn't need to raise her voice to make the room align. Sometimes she opens the meeting with a short gesture. Sometimes the rule is read first, to remind us that even the abbess is not above the structure. And then the day is divided. Who goes to the kitchen, who to the infirmary, who to the workrooms, who to the chapel, who to the storerooms. That division of labor is the reason the convent survives. There are sacerdotal duties, rules that sound ordinary until you realize how much depends on them. The prioress is the abbess's deputy, the one who makes sure the abbess's decisions actually become reality. The cellarer manages supplies, grain, ale, saltfish, firewood, linens, everything that keeps bodies alive. The sacristan cares for the chapel and its objects, candles, altar cloths, the cleanliness of sacred space. The infirmary tends the sick, mixing herbs, preparing compresses, watching fevers, sitting through long nights beside women who can no longer rise when the bell rings.
and the novice mistress trains the new ones, teaching not only prayers, but posture, silence, and the 1,000 small rules that keep us from turning into chaos. From a modern point of view, it's almost impossible not to see it as an organization, a closed system with internal governance, clear rules, clear accountability. The structure isn't decorative, it's survival. And yet, even with all that order, the convent is not made of angels, it's made of people. Living together like this, sharing dormitories, work, food, silence, and exhaustion, creates bonds that are hard to explain to anyone outside. We become in a way each other's family. We see each other at our best and our worst. We watch each other age, we watch each other become ill, we bury each other. There's a tenderness in that. When a sister is sick, she isn't left alone. The infirmary comes. Other sisters come too, quietly, with water, with blankets, with small acts of care. The help is practical, but it's also emotional, because illness in a convent doesn't only threaten a person, it threatens the rhythm. When someone can't rise, can't chant, can't work, the rest of the community feels the gap. I once helped in the infirmary with an elderly sister whose hand shook so badly she could no longer hold a cup. I supported her shoulders while she drank, and she gripped my sleeve afterward as if she needed proof that someone was still there. No one said anything. We didn't need to. Her hand was the sentence. But a community that close also creates friction. Friendships form, of course, mentorships too. But tensions form as well. Quiet rivalries, misunderstandings, small resentments that, if they're ignored, can grow like mold in a dark corner. This is why the chapter meeting matters so much. It's not only administration, it's conflict management. There is a moment in chapter when sisters may admit small faults or raise grievances or accept correction. It's meant to keep the community from storing poison in silence. Ideally, you confess a sharp word before it becomes a feud. You resolve a misunderstanding before it becomes a faction. Ideally. I've seen it work. I've also seen how fragile it is. There was a period when a minor office was being reassigned, and the air in chapter became strangely tense. No one shouted, no one accused anyone directly, but you could feel it. The subtle turning of heads, the careful way some sisters watched the abbess's reactions, the way certain groups sat a little closer together, as if proximity could become a shield. If you've lived in the modern world, you recognize it immediately. People don't need swords to form sides. They do it with glances, with loyalty, with the quiet math of us and them. The abbess sensed it too. She said almost nothing at first. She simply waited, let the silence stretch. And in that stretched silence, the tension began to look foolish, because it was suddenly exposed. Then she spoke, calmly, in one sentence that landed like a stone in a pond. We chant the same psalms together every night. If we can't yield to each other over a small duty, what do we think we're doing here? No one argued with her, not because she was frightening, but because she was right. And truth in a place like this has a particular force. Still, even when conflicts are resolved, the reality remains. The convent is not free from human complexity. It contains it. It tries to shape it. That shaping is part of the vow. And then there is the question of influence, because despite the walls, the convent is not invisible to the world. We cannot celebrate Mass ourselves, so priests come in and out of our orbit. Messengers arrive with letters. Stewards come to report on rents or harvests. Benefactors send gifts. Bishops arrive for visitation and inspection. Through all of them, the outside world presses against the wall like weather. I've seen the abbess meet with a steward through the parlor grill. I've watched her eyes move over a rent roll and recognized that what she was doing was not women's work in the way the world defines it. It was governance, it was economics, it was protection of the house. In some places, abbesses correspond with powerful figures, nobles, bishops, sometimes even kings. That's rare but not impossible, and it's one of the quiet truths of medieval life. The cloister can be a place where a woman's voice carries farther than it would in a marriage bed. Even when the convent is humble, it still holds something the world respects: prayer. People outside believe our prayers matter in a special way. They bring their intentions, they ask for remembrance, they give gifts not only out of generosity, but because they want the house to continue offering prayers for their souls. From a modern perspective, you might call that spiritual economy, a kind of exchange, material support for spiritual labor. It sounds cynical when you say it that way, but inside the convent it feels different. It feels like responsibility, like being asked to carry part of the world's fear and hope, even from behind a wall. And there's another truth, one that is hard to romanticize. A convent is a place where you learn what a community costs. It costs you privacy, it costs you the right to always be understood, it costs you the comfort of leaving when you're angry, it costs you the option of reinventing yourself every season the way modern people like to do. In return, it gives you something rare. It gives you constancy. It gives you women who will sit beside your bed when you're ill, women who will sing for you when you die, women who will remember you even if the world doesn't. I've seen a funeral in this chapel. The candles low, the air thick with incense, the chants steady as stone. When the body was carried through the cloister to the burial ground, the sisters moved with such careful coordination that it felt like watching a single creature take a final breath. No drama, no spectacle, just the quiet weight of a life closed. And afterward, the bell rang again, because that's the final lesson the convent teaches you. Grief does not stop the rhythm. Joy does not stop the rhythm. Conflict does not stop the rhythm. The world outside might be on fire, and the convent will still chant at the appointed hour. Some days that feels like mercy. Some days it feels like an impossible demand. But either way, it's real, and it's why the convent endures. So when I stand in the chapter house now and look at the abbess, at the prioress, at the sisters who keep the storerooms counted and the altar ready and the sick tended, I don't see a simple religious life. I see a disciplined system built to keep fragile humans moving toward a shared purpose. And I see myself inside it, learning slowly what it means to belong to something that doesn't revolve around my moods, my preferences, or my comfort. It revolves around the bell, and every morning when it rings, the community turns again, like a wheel that never stops.
Everything here is measured. A small wicket opens. A hand appears. Bread passes through. Sometimes a little broth. Sometimes a few scraps of cloth. The rule calls it charity, and it is, but it's charity performed at a distance, shaped by enclosure. I can hear their coughs, their murmured thanks, the shuffle of feet in mud. But I'm not meant to linger at the opening and look too closely, as if compassion might become curiosity, and curiosity might become a crack in the wall. From the outside, people sometimes think this distance is cruelty, like a prison window. And I won't pretend it never feels that way. There are moments when I want to push the door wider, step out, put my arms around a trembling child, and stop thinking about rules for a single heartbeat. But the convent isn't built for impulses. It's built for endurance. And the strange truth is this: even without stepping outside, we still matter to the people at the gate. They come because they believe we will be consistent. They come because we will still be here tomorrow. The wall makes our help limited, yes, but it also makes it reliable. That is how the outside world touches us first, through need. The second way the world touches us is through the church itself, because we cannot do everything we pray about. We cannot celebrate Mass. We cannot hear confessions. Those things require a priest. So a chaplain comes, regularly, moving through carefully controlled spaces. He stands on the other side of the choir screen, his Latin prayers drifting to us through wood and stone. We answer from behind the lattice, voices held inside our side of the chapel. It's a strange arrangement, full of meaning. On one hand, it reminds you that you are part of something larger than this convent. The wider church is alive beyond the walls, with bishops, councils, reforms, arguments, politics. The chaplain is like a thread connecting our quiet corner to that vast world. On the other hand, the separation stings. We are there, but not quite there. Near, but not close. Listening to sacred words from behind a barrier, as if holiness itself must be rationed. Sometimes after Mass, the chaplain brings news. Quietly, carefully. Not gossip, but information. A bad harvest, a death in a noble house, a sickness moving through villages, a dispute between local lords. Even when he says little, you learn to hear the outside world in his pauses, the way his voice carries fatigue, the way he chooses words as if every detail might disturb the cloister's fragile calm. The third way the world enters is through letters. Letters arrive like small pieces of weather from another land. They come through the parlor, through iron grills and turntable hatches, passed hand to hand without bodies meeting. The abbess controls what is received and what is answered, because correspondence is another form of contact, and contact is always a risk. When a letter arrives for me, I don't simply open it in my bed like a girl at home. I read it under permission, often under supervision. The very act of receiving a message becomes part of discipline. And yet, even with all those restrictions, a letter can shake you. A few lines from my mother, asking if I'm warm enough, if I'm eating, if my health is steady, can bring the manor hall back into my throat like smoke. A note from my father, written in the stiff language of duty, can make me feel like I'm once again a piece of a family plan. News from my sisters, marriage, pregnancy, a child's birth, reminds me that the world continues to unfold without me, like a river that doesn't slow because one person stepped away from its bank. In the convent, family doesn't disappear. It changes shape. We become, in a sense, relatives who cannot touch, daughters who offer prayer instead of presents, sisters who send blessings instead of help. It's not nothing, but it is a different kind of love, more distant, more disciplined, and sometimes more painful because of that distance. And then there are gifts. Noble families who have daughters behind these walls often remain connected through patronage. A basket of food at a feast day, a bolt of cloth, a sack of grain delivered to the gate, sometimes money, sealed and counted and recorded in the abbess's accounts. To the outside world, it might look like simple generosity, but there's always another layer. Gifts carry expectations, not crude demands perhaps, but a quiet hope that the sisters will pray for a soul, remember a name, offer intercession for a family in trouble. From a modern point of view, you might call it a kind of exchange, material support for spiritual labor. That sounds cold when you phrase it like that, but living here, I've come to see it as something more complicated. Patrons keep us alive. We keep their memory alive. And in a world where people fear death and judgment with an intensity modern minds sometimes forget, prayer is not symbolic, it's protection. The convent, even enclosed, becomes a kind of engine, turning gifts into endurance, endurance into prayer, prayer into a sense of safety for people who live much closer to hunger and violence than I do now. There is another bridge to the outside world, one that surprised me: education. Some convents, including ours at times, take in girls, usually from families with means, so they can learn to read, to write a little, to sew properly, to learn the prayers that make them respectable. They live with us for a season, and then most return to the world to marry. When I teach them, I feel the strangeness of time. They sit on benches, hands small and restless, trying to copy letters on wax tablets or parchment scraps.
They whisper when they forget themselves. They look out the window with the hunger of young minds that still believe the world is wide. I watch them and I see my own past, as if I'm looking through clear water into a life I once lived. Some of them will go back and become wives and mothers. A few perhaps will later return to take the veil. And every time one leaves, walking out through the parlor toward a way-end family, I feel something complicated in my chest. Not envy exactly, not regret. More like the awareness of forks in the road, how close they can be, and how final the choice feels once you've stepped on one path. Beyond these formal connections, priests, letters, patrons, pupils, there are also rumors. Rumors travel through walls the way cold does, through tiny cracks you can't seal. I once heard sisters speaking quietly about devout women in towns who live together without taking permanent vows. Women who pray, work, care for the sick, and yet remain in the world. In some regions, they're known as beguines. They aren't nuns, and that is exactly what makes them fascinating. They stand in the space between. Not wives, not cloistered, not fully controlled by enclosure. When you live behind a wall, the idea of a life devoted to God without a locked gate can sound almost impossible, and it can sound dangerous. Not because devotion is dangerous, but because freedom is. The church itself often doesn't know what to do with women who are devout and independent. Some clergy respect them, some fear disorder. And inside the convent, the very idea can tug at you like a loose thread. Is there another way? I'm careful with that thought. Thoughts like that can become storms, and yet I can't deny it. The walls don't stop me from imagining. Even when the convent feels sealed, the outside world presses in through every controlled opening, through bread at the gate, through a priest's voice behind a screen, through the dry crackle of parchment in my hands, through a child's face in the schoolroom, through the whisper of an unfamiliar form of devotion. So what is a cloister really? From the outside, it looks like isolation. From the inside, it feels more like filtration. The world doesn't disappear. It arrives in measured drops. And because it arrives in drops, it often feels heavier. A single piece of news about sickness in the village can make the sisters pray harder that night. A letter about a death can change the air in the dormitory for days. A line of hungry people at the gate can follow me into the chapel like a shadow. This is what I've learned. The convent is not separate from society in the way a stone is separate from water. It is more like a deep place in the river, still connected, still shaped by the current, but moving differently. We rarely step outside these walls, but the world still touches us, and whether we admit it or not, we touch it back, through prayer, through charity, through teaching, through the quiet work that keeps a flame of meaning burning when everything else outside feels uncertain. Sometimes I think that's the truest reason people build walls around places like this, not to erase the world, but to hold a certain kind of response to it, steady, disciplined, enduring, no matter what the world becomes.
Close enough to hear the edges of their voices. They weren't gossiping in the crude way people gossip outside. It was quieter than that, like they were handling a fragile thing. They spoke of other women, other houses, other rules, and I felt something in me tighten, because even behind walls, you can sense when history is shifting. In our convent, everything is arranged for stability. We follow the Benedictine way, prayer and work, measured discipline, and enclosure that protects focus. It's a life shaped to last. But beyond our walls, I began to understand, not all religious women lived the same life. There were other communities, some stricter than ours, some different in purpose, some shaped by new movements that were only just beginning to gather force. I didn't see them with my own eyes, not truly. I only saw them in fragments, images formed by stories, by descriptions, by the way a name landed on the tongue of an older sister. I heard of Cistercian women, for example, reformers who prized simplicity so fiercely that even their churches were plain, their habits undyed, their silence deeper. People called them white nuns, and the picture that came into my mind was stark: a cold stone chapel without ornament, a table without indulgence, a discipline that made even our Benedictine routine feel gentle by comparison. Then I heard of other religious women attached to hospitals, canonices following a different rule, more involved with care, not wandering the streets like lay healers, but still closer to the sick and the poor than we were allowed to be. Women whose devotion looked less like enclosure and more like service at the edge of society. And then came the most unsettling rumor of all: women living devout lives in towns without taking permanent vows, women who prayed, worked, and served, yet were not enclosed. In some places, people were beginning to call them beguines. They weren't wives. They weren't nuns. They lived in the space between, and the church didn't always know what to do with them. That thought stayed with me longer than I wanted it to, because when you live behind a wall, the very idea of devotion without a locked gate can feel like a door you didn't know existed. It can feel like freedom, and freedom can be as frightening as it is tempting. Not long after those murmured conversations, a merchant arrived at the parlor on the visitor side. He had brought cloth and small goods, and with them he brought stories from far roads, stories half true, half shaped by travel, but vivid enough to lodge in the mind. He spoke of the south, of Italy,
of wandering holy men who embraced poverty so completely it embarrassed those who lived comfortably. He didn't have all the names right. He didn't need to. The shape of the story was enough. People choosing a life stripped down to nothing, depending on charity, singing as they walked, serving the sick, rejecting property. In the year I entered this convent, around the turn of the century, those movements were only beginning to grow, but you could already feel the air stirring, like wind before a storm. You don't see it, but everything around you begins to shift in response. That night, after Compline, the great silence fell, and I lay in my bed with the weight of those rumors pressing into my chest. I told myself to let it go. I told myself it was none of my concern. I told myself my vow was my life, and imagining other lives was a kind of disobedience. But the mind does not always obey the way the body does, and so I dreamed. In the dream, the cloister garth was gone. The stone arches and the cold well in the square garden vanished as if someone had lifted the entire convent away like a cloth. In its place was open land under moonlight, mist rolling low over grass. I stood in my black habit, the veil tugged by wind that felt too real to be only sleep. In front of me rose an enormous tree, ancient, rooted deep, its bark rough and heavy with age. From its branches hung strips of cloth, dozens of them, moving slowly in the night air. Black like my habit, pale like undyed wool, gray, brown, colors that reminded me of stricter houses, of poorer lives, of those wandering stories the merchant had brought. The ribbons lifted and fell like breathing. I stepped closer. The grass bent under my feet. My robe hem dragged through damp blades, and the weight of the cloth was real. The way weight is real in a dream that refuses to feel like fantasy. I reached out toward one of the rough brown ribbons, coarse, humble, the color of dust and road. My fingers hovered just short of it. And then the wind pulled it away, not dramatically, just enough, like the world teasing me with a choice it would not let me take. That was when I felt it. Not the bell in the tower, not a bell outside, a bell inside me, an invisible strike of sound that landed in my chest, sharp and absolute, as if the rhythm of the convent had followed me even into sleep, stamping its claim on my body and mind. I woke up gasping in the dormitory darkness, the oil lamp low, the rafters above like black ribs. My hands gripped the blanket so tightly my fingers ached. I forced myself to loosen them one by one, and my breathing slowed. No one else stirred. Around me the sisters slept in disciplined stillness, breath faint in the cold air. The convent held its silence the way it always does, solid, unyielding, as if nothing inside it could ever change. But I had changed, at least a little, because that dream wasn't about wanting to run away. It was about realizing that the life I had chosen, or been given, was only one form of devotion among many, and that the world beyond our walls was not fixed. It was alive, restless, adapting, searching for new ways to belong to God. Soon after the bell called again. It always does. I hand-pulled the robe somewhere in the cloister niche, and the sound cut through the dormitory like a blade of light. Bodies rose, hammocks were gathered, veils were set. The line formed without words. The cloister turned us toward the chapel the way a river turns leaves stream. When I stepped into the procession, I felt the dream still clinging to me like mist. I wanted to hold it at arm's length, to examine it with reason. But the convent doesn't grant you much space for examination. It gives you the next step. The chapel door opened, candlelight pulled in the darkness. We took our places in the stalls, and matins began. The chant rose, steady and controlled, breath visible, Latin syllables shaped by tired mouths, and as always the stone answered us with echoes. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. This life is not kept alive by dramatic moments. It is kept alive by the repeated decision to return. Return to the stall, return to the chant, return to the bell, return to the rule even when your mind has wandered to other roads. From a modern point of view, I can see it almost like training, the way routine builds a structure strong enough to contain doubt, the way constant resets through prayer, through silence, through communal rhythm can keep a person from being swallowed by fear or longing. But living inside it, it feels less like training and more like being held by stone, held by sound, held by the presence of other women who are walking the same narrow path, step by step, day after day. The world outside might be changing. New orders might rise, new movements might spread through towns and roads and marketplaces. Reform might come and stricter rules might be written, and future generations might find themselves enclosed more tightly than we are now. But in that moment, standing in the candlelit chapel, chanting with the community, I felt the weight of the truth that never changes. Whatever else happens, the bell will ring, and we will answer. Not because we are fearless, not because we never wonder about other lives, but because the vow is not one grand heroic act. It is the patient, stubborn, human act of returning, again and again, to the same rhythm until it becomes the shape of your soul.
Would turn us into something clean and untouchable, like figures in stained glass. But real life here isn't stained glass. It's stone floors, sore knees, cold mornings, and women trying, sometimes failing, to live up to vows that are bigger than any one person. You can see it most clearly in the chapter house. In the early hours, when the candles are still burning low and the air tastes of damp limestone, we gather on the stone benches and listen to the rule. It's read aloud the way it always is, steady, unemotional, as if the words themselves don't care what mood you woke up with. And then, one by one, small faults come forward. A sister who arrived late to prayer, someone who spoke when she shouldn't, a mistake in the storeroom, a task left unfinished, a careless tone. Nothing dramatic, but nothing trivial either. Because in a closed community, tiny cracks are never just tiny. A small slip can become a habit, and habits become a culture. The abbess knows that. That's why discipline here is usually quiet but consistent. A penance might be extra prayers. It might be taking a humbler place at table. It might be a duty meant to remind you that your pride is not more important than the community. I remember the first time I saw a sister eat apart from the bench, seated on the floor as penance. It wasn't cruel. No one mocked her, no one stared. The silence was almost heavier than judgment. And watching her, I realized how this place actually functions, not through punishment, but through controlled shame, through correction that keeps the group aligned. From a modern point of view, it's easy to see the logic. A system like this survives by keeping small problems small. It creates predictable consequences. It maintains trust by showing that rules apply to everyone, even the respected, even the long professed. It's governance. Spiritual, yes, but also social engineering in the most literal sense. And still, even with all that structure, the convent is not immune to messiness. Some sisters get attached to small comforts, a favorite corner by the fire, an extra portion of bread offered by a friend, a little pet hidden away, something harmless, something soft in a life made mostly of rough cloth and rough stone. People outside might imagine this as scandal. Inside, it's usually just human need leaking through the seams of discipline. Other problems come from outside pressures, not personal weakness. There are years when the harvest is poor, years when the granary feels emptier than it should, when winter arrives early and firewood becomes precious. In those times, prayer doesn't stop, but it changes. It becomes heavier, more urgent, because hunger and cold have a way of sharpening the mind. I've stood in the storeroom and watched the seller pause over a jar that should have been fuller. I've watched her count sacks of grain like counting days of safety. In moments like that, you understand something that sounds uncomfortable but is simply true. A convent can't live on vows alone. It lives on bread, wood, water, and the careful work of people who manage resources without wasting them. And then there's the opposite danger. When gifts arrive, fine cloth, extra food, a donation from a patron, comfort can creep in quietly, not like a feast, but like permission. Permission to loosen discipline. Permission to invite more visitors. Permission to treat enclosure as a guideline instead of a boundary. The church has always feared that slow drift. That's why bishops perform visitations. They come to inspect, sometimes kindly, sometimes sternly. They ask questions. They watch for laxity. They pressure abbesses to tighten the rule when a community grows too relaxed. Even when a visitation is polite, it's stressful, because it reminds everyone that the cloister isn't a private world. It exists under authority. I remember a visitation day as a kind of cold brightness. The chapel feels smaller when an outsider stands beyond the screen. The sister's posture becomes sharper. The silence becomes less peaceful and more guarded. You can almost feel everyone thinking the same thought. Do we look like what we claim to be? Afterward, the abbess calls us together and speaks carefully. No shouting, no drama. Just a steady tightening, like pulling a cord until the fabric sits right again. More attention to silence, more precision in daily observance, less room for casualness. And then the day goes on, because it always does. Sometimes, while I'm watching these corrections happen, I think about the future, about the way rules harden over time. In the late 13th century, long after my own lifetime, a papal decree will be issued that pushes enclosure even further, insisting that nuns remain strictly enclosed. If you say the year out loud, it sounds simple, 1298, but the weight of it is not simple. It's a sign that the wider church decided at some point that women's religious life needed tighter walls, not looser ones. When I imagine that future, I don't feel triumph or anger, I feel recognition. Institutions respond to risk by tightening, and in the medieval world full of rumors, scandals, and political pressures, women behind walls were always going to become a focus of control. But here's the strange thing. Even with inspections, reforms, and human weakness, the convent endures. It endures because it isn't built on one person's purity. It's built on repetition. It's built on shared rhythm. It's built on the ability to return, again and again, to the same practices even when your heart isn't shining. There are days when I feel that endurance like a burden. Days when the schedule feels relentless. When the bell feels like it's carving my life into pieces I didn't choose. And there are days when that same schedule feels like shelter. When the world outside seems chaotic. Bad news, sickness, conflict. And inside the walls we still rise, still chant, still eat, still work, still keep the lamp burning. The older I get in this life, the more I understand that the vow is not one dramatic moment at the altar. It's not a single heroic leap. It's the steady, ordinary decision to keep going. To fold the linen again, to grind the herbs again, to copy the words again, to bow again, to forgive again, to sleep knowing the bell will wake you before your body is ready, and to rise anyway. If you asked me now whether I regret becoming a nun, I still wouldn't give you a neat answer. Life here is both confinement and opportunity. It limits your movement, but it can widen your mind. It can silence you, but it can also protect you from a world that would have reduced you to marriage contracts and dowry sums. And sometimes in the middle of the night office, when the candles are low and the chapel smells of stone and smoke, I feel something that has nothing to do with romance and everything to do with meaning. I feel that I am part of a long chain of voices, women whose names may never be written in chronicles, but whose days were offered anyway, offered in the simplest currency they had, time. The bell rings, we wake, we chant, we work, we eat, we keep silence, we sleep. And then the bell rings again. That is the real ending and the real beginning, every day. The world may forget us. History may compress us into a footnote or a stereotype or nothing at all. But inside these walls, the rhythm continues, steady as breath, steady as stone, because even imperfect people can build something lasting when they return, together, to the same vow, one ordinary day at a time.